I never know where to start these talks, so I just talk about church records and to say that we don't have any. The council doesn't hold them because obviously they're the church's property. I don't know if any of you have ever seen this image before, or this diagram showing the history of the church in Scotland from about 1700 up to the 1950s, and just the way that it's schismed, come back together, fallen out. You know, the history of the church in Scotland is a two-night talk in itself. And has anybody here ever heard of anti-burgers? Yeah. And burgers, yeah, and the old licks and stuff? It was all new to me when I moved to Scotland. But anyway, what this kind of demonstrates is the history of the church in Scotland is pretty complicated and it's not getting any easier. But obviously, with such a changeable landscape over the last couple of hundred years, the survival of earlier records is not phenomenally great. Obviously, when the church changes hands or there's changes in ministers, it's always a dangerous time for records where they either kind of get neglected, fought over, or squirreled away as private items. So we're not 100% sure what the state of church records in the islands is at the moment. We've been out to a couple of different denominations just to get a feel for the kind of records that some of them have. And I'm sure many of these are familiar to you in the sense of Kirk session records, deacons' court minutes, communion rolls, etc., which are obviously really important from the genealogical point of view pre-1855, when we don't have any birth, deaths and marriage records. They're still with the church. But we don't know what the situation is in North Lochs. So if any of you want to talk to me afterwards about any church records you might know in the area, I'd be very interested to hear from you. The Church of Scotland, as the established church, has a process for its own records, in that the churches are supposed to give them up to the head office in Edinburgh. They then transfer them to the National Archives of Scotland, who do conservation work and digitise them. And then, when there's an established local authority archive in the area, the records come back to the area to be looked after by the local authority archive. No records from the Church of Scotland in the islands have ever gone to Edinburgh. For understandable reasons, people are kind of loath to let them go, and I completely understand that. But with Lewes Castle coming on board with a formal archive service there, it's hoped that anything that does go will come immediately back. There are some presbytery records down there dating back to the early 1700s, which would be fantastic to have on the island, where they actually have a relationship to the island, and will hopefully be full of lots of information to do with the internal power struggles of the islands and the establishments of churches and the appointments of ministers. Moving on from church records, we're really kind of getting into kind of local government records, and these really start to appear in the 1840s. When there's a move from the church being the main power base and the landowner through to kind of more central government administrative structures coming in. And this is where we start to get the bulk of the modern archives that are in, well, modern, inverted commas, archives that are in the Caller's collections. It already kicked off in 1845 with the Poor Law Act, which established parochial boards, which later on became known as parish councils. The boards and later parish councils dealt with some matters relating to roads, taxation and water supplies, but the bulk of their work was actually spent dealing with the poor in their area. Previously to this, charities and the church had taken a lead role in this area with assistance from the landowners and the islands. North Lochs fell within the Lochs parochial board, which obviously goes all the way down to Harris from here, and at that point covered across to Carloway, and even I think Shawbost might have just kind of tipped the edge of this one as well. Judging by some of the records that I've looked at. So the main role of the board was the collection and distribution of poor relief to those in need. The board employed an inspector of the poor, whose job it was to visit those in need, and he could give out financial aid on the spot or arrange to have the provision of clothing or minor building repairs done to people's houses. More serious cases were referred to the board, who would then sit in judgment on the case and decide whether that person was going to get ongoing aid over a period of time, or whether they weren't worthy of any help, or whether they weren't actually their problem. A bit like, Jesus of Nazareth and Bethlehem, you were the problem of the parish that you were born in. So if you were from Glasgow or, Govan, then it was Govan's problem, regardless of the fact that you might have been in Stornoway. So it could be a bit cutthroat. So the main records we have for the parish councils are the minutes of the councils itself, which we only have from 1910. We don't know where the earlier ones are. They don't seem to have survived, which obviously talk about the main the main issues in the area. The applications for parochial relief, which were the record kept by the Inspector of the Poor saying, this is who I visited, this is the assessment I made of them, this is the help that I gave them, and also whether he felt that they should be kind of passed on to the board for a decision. And then if they were felt to be a long-term case, we have the General Register of the Poor, where you get a long-term history of the individuals and their relationship with the board. As you can see, we don't have, the dates don't run nicely, we don't have everything that overlaps. But when you use these records together, you actually get some quite good detail about individuals. I don't know how clear this is. This is a page from the General Register of the Poor from 1890 for a lady from Rhenish. So you can start to see some of the information that comes through. The date that she asked for help, the fact that she was being given 1 shilling a week. You can see over here. You even get religion, her job, which is she's down as being a crofter, but she's also a widow. But possibly the most interesting, for me anyway, is the description of the disablement. Why is it that they're asking for help? And I don't know if anyone can read that, but I think it says the youth of her children is the reason why she needs help. And if you look over here, you actually get a list of her children and their ages, which seem to be from 10 down to about 2 or possibly even 9 months there. Was it? I hope you don't mind. I used as early a record as I could so that because these are very sensitive records, and a lot of them we can't use. At the bottom of the page, you get a detail of their history and relationship with the board. So you can see here, she went from being on 1 shilling up to getting 8 shillings a month, and then it reduced down over time until she came off the roll in 1902. Sometimes it'll say died, and that's why they come off the roll. Other times it's because they've actually kind of got themselves sorted out and they can look after themselves. So a couple of other case studies that I've pulled out, and I have anonymised a lot of this and changed names because I didn't want to step on anyone's toes or cause any embarrassment. But in 1918, a female from Rhenish is recorded as living on her brother's croft. She'd supported herself by working in the neighbourhood on crofts and at the peats up until now, but due to advancing age, she feels unable to work. The Poor Law Inspector records her as a respectable and industrious woman all her life. At this age, she's 62. So, you know, she's living alone, done her time. So, you know, maybe she's due a bit of help. She was admitted onto the roll for only 3 years because when she gets to 65, she starts getting a pension. So she's struck off, if that's the right word. Another female, age 49. The applicant resides with her younger sister, who is married and has 1 child aged 11. Her husband is in America for the last 9 years, but doesn't send any support for the wife or child. She hasn't got any stock of her own on her croft, and at the time that the inspector visits, she doesn't have any food. And in this instance, the inspector just handed over a bowl of meal, and the case kind of continued from there. We have another gentleman, age 52, who's a crofter. He has 2 cows and a number of sheep, and all of this is coming straight out of here. So this is information you're not going to get from any other source. He has no family but himself and his wife. He doesn't want any assistance from the parish council. He's, you know, to go to the parish and say, I want help is quite a demeaning thing at the time. You know, the poor law and the poorhouse are really something you don't want to get involved with if you can help it. But he's asking for a little money to help pay for the lifting of his harvest. So it's a very practical. One more case, which is a little bit more detailed, which is a Murdo MacDonald, who's a fisherman, aged 34. And he puts in an application for assistance, but it's put in on his behalf by a friend, presumably because he's incapacitated and can't do it himself. He has 4 children, all aged under the 8, the youngest being 10 weeks old. He himself is suffering from rheumatic fever and is therefore unable to work and therefore needs the help. The parish would have expected his family to be the first port of call to help him out, but the record records that both of his parents are dead and therefore can't support him. He has a small house on his uncle's croft, and his own wife is recorded as being a patient in the Inverness District Asylum. This is only 10 weeks after the birth of her child. Somebody else is paid 5 shillings a week to attend to the children, presumably when he was out working. And his income is described as the kindness of relatives. So, you know, he's got nothing else but what other people can do for him. Poor Law Inspector automatically gives him 1 shilling a week, and the case is referred to the parish council. 2 pages on in the same volume, there's an application on behalf of his wife, Donna. And that's made by her brother, presumably again because the husband's incapacitated. It talks about how she's been removed to the asylum, and the parish takes on the payments for her costs of being in the asylum. She dies within a year. Just after her death, her husband's ailment, her money, is reduced from it's a pound, not a shilling, to 16 shillings and threepence. And a year later, when his eldest child hits 10, it's reduced to 10 shillings. After 4 years of being on the roll, he's removed completely, presumably because he's well enough to be back out fishing. Pick up some quite intimate details about people's lives. These records can be tough going for someone that's coming to them fresh. And if any of you remember Who Do You Think You Are, and Jeremy Paxman sitting in Rutherglen bursting into tears, it was because of the poor law records that set him off, and seeing it in a context. The archivist who was involved in that programme, Eilean and Brian from Glasgow City Archives, is now generally known in archive circles as the woman who made Paxman cry. And she wears that one quite proudly. However, they can be amazingly rewarding. So in the past, we've had researchers come in and use these records because they found out that someone was a pauper through the census records, and they've traced through. And because it gives details of family and where children are, because it was the children and the family that were supposed to support you before you fell to the parish, you get information about people having emigrated, families in Australia, and we've had people find whole new branches of their family and links to other parts of the world, which they really didn't know that they had. And these records have never really been used before. The reason for that is obviously they're very sensitive and personal, but we've also put a 100-year closure period on them. So until they're 100 years old, no one can look at them. So they're only just coming out of that period. And even on the islands, I'm still get jumpy about 100 years not being maybe quite long enough. In Glasgow, it's not an issue because the turnaround of people is so high, but in relatively stable and static communities, you know, memories are long. And as you pointed out, you already spotted your aunt. So, oh, great aunt, sorry, yes. In severe cases of poverty, obviously, the next stage was the Poorhouse, which is at the top of Westview Terrace. I'm sure many of you probably remember the building because I think it was still standing until the 80s. A poorhouse could have been established in Lewis any time after 1845 with the Poor Law Act, and they left it till the 1890s. They really didn't want to build one. There were a number of poor houses around the islands, which were just literally, you know, a croft or maybe a bunkhouse where people would stay. There was one in Stag Road in town. There was one down in Lemraway. There were a couple down in the Ewists as well. Was there as well? Brilliant.
Well, there were specific ones for specific districts. I read in a copy of the Eilean News, probably about 1910, that the Lochs Poorhouse was in Keith Street.
Yeah, I don't know about that, but I don't know what happened before the 1891 was built. But certainly, generally, anybody in Lewis ended up in Stornoway eventually after 1890s. Harris people had to go to Lochmaddy because it formed part of. Well, it was the border of Inverness was the border of Harris, so they went down there. So anyway, so this is I love this picture, partly because it's just got a donkey or something hanging around the front door, and you can see all the people just kind of stood outside over on the left-hand side. It's not the clearest of images. The minutes of the Poorhouse are held by the Tasglann. They run from the 1890s through to 1970, by which time it had become part of Dunbarmesay and Coragrain. The house was jointly erected by the 4 parochial boards of Lewis, and from the outset, there was the usual inter-parish arguments that you'd expect from any decision to be made in Lewis about who's paying for it and who's getting the major benefit. So the each parish was to pay, which depended on the number of beds that each parish had, and there was 4 parishes in Lewis. Needless to say, Stornoway had the largest share, and this was increased when the other 3 parishes of Uig, Barvas and Lochs all said that they didn't need so many beds. Life in the house was deliberately hard. Not quite Oliver Twist, but not far off. But it was only meant to be a temporary home somewhere where you went for a while till you were back on your feet. However, many people ended up there because they had no one else to look after themselves look after them in their old age, and essentially they went there to die, or it was a temporary home. So the minute book of the house gives details of the daily rations of food that people are allowed. And I've got the original list out there, so if you can't read this, that's perfectly reasonable. And it was pretty mean. Focusing on the Monday morning at 8 o'clock, you got bread, a cup of tea with some sugar and margarine. That lasted you to 12 noon, where you got some fish and potatoes, which was alternated with meat later on in the week. At 3 p.m, you got some more bread, tea and margarine. And in the evening, your evening meal at 8:30 was porridge with milk. And that had to see you through to your main meal the next day. And this is 1929. No, it's living memory. So, they certainly weren't encouraging you to stay, put it that way. So for inmates, as they were called, it was the parishes that sent them to the poorhouse due to their poverty or inability to look after themselves. We have a separate dietary book, which unfortunately I can't show you because it's still covered by data protection. But within it, it records the condition of individuals when they came into the poorhouse. And this was pretty blunt, as you can probably imagine. So things like people being described as deaf and dumb, having rheumatism, homeless, neuralgia or pain, blind. And in one case, there was one female who's listed as being morally weak. She lasted 5 months and then she went off onto the herring. So we're not quite sure what morally weak was, but who knows. One record that has survived from the poorhouse, which is by which time the poor law was abolished in 1930, and it really became a residential home from the 1930s onwards. But from 1941, as part of the war effort, they started growing their own vegetables. So the front lawns were given over to bedding plants. And we've got 20 years worth of yearly drawings of the crop rotation that they were doing in the gardens. And so presumably the inmates were helping with this, which is fascinating because I've never seen it. On a croft, you'd probably just do it from memory. But for here, for some reason, they were documenting it, to the point that they even told you what kind of type of potatoes they were growing, golden wonders, the type of brassicas that were going in, etc. We've digitised this and we've made it available to school groups who are doing crofting, because it's one of the few practical examples we've seen where you can actually look at a bed over a period and see how the soil was being managed. So the teachers love this, and the Soil Association, who have been supporting the Crofting Connections project, thought this was the best thing ever. So the upshot of the poor law stuff is essentially if you've come across someone in a family history or someone you're researching that's listed as a pauper in the census or died in the poorhouse, there's a good chance we'll have something on them and we can trace them back and add to your knowledge of that person. Slightly more dry is getting into the real local government records. Up until 1890, much of the infrastructure to do with the island was really down to the landlords, the Mackenzies, the Mathesons, and the Commissioners of Supply, who were based over in Dingwall, which Mathesons and the Mackenzies all sat on, who dealt with roads, bridges, harbours, etc. In 1890, the county council system as we now know it came into being with the establishment of Ross and Cromarty Council. And they created district committees all around the islands and the Highlands, which essentially answered to them and did their work at a local level. I don't know how easy this is to read with, was really dealing with roads. And all of the councillors jumped in for Lochs area and all over the island, with the exception of Ness, I think it is, shouting, "We need new roads." And at the first meeting, it was pitched that it is expedient in the interest of the district that a branch road be formed from Lurbost and Rhenish through to the moor, joining the main road at Stornoway, a distance of 4 miles or nearby. So the history of that road is documented, and its development is documented through these minute series, which run from 1890 through to 1930. Roads were a key feature, but it wasn't always to the landowner's pleasure. The Pentland Road last year was 100 years old, and shortly after it was opened, this appeared in the minutes. There was submitted a letter from Major Matheson, proprietor of the Lewis, dated 15th of September, protesting against a road made over his property being named after Lord Pentland. The clerk was instructed to reply that the road had already been named and that the committee cannot now see their way to alter it. So there, basically. The committee subcommittees give you some idea of their activities. Roads were a prominent feature, and bridges, finance and public health, who also responsible for employing things like medical officers and sanitary inspectors. The committees would discuss the works to be done across the islands, but also take evidence from local crofters and cotters on their own issues relating to land requirements and roads, and work with government inquiries. So there is often reference in here to things with the land struggles around the islands, and people have used it to research that. The agenda for a meeting in 1920 included, amongst other things, housing for crofters, district health in Point, water supplies to Ness, mail services, roads, the Moss End Fever Hospital, the appointment of a medical officer of health, nurses' pay, infectious diseases in Tolster, level crossings at Sandwick, where they had a railroad for a while, and providing a motorbike for the sanitary inspector, which I kind of love the idea of them zooming around the islands. From 1910s onwards, the committee really took on the roles of providing district nursing, and prior to the advent of the NHS, it's these records that really tell you about the health in the islands and where you can come and do that kind of basic research to do with district nurses and doctors. In the First World War, the committee played its part. They petitioned the military authorities to request an extra 4 days leave for the soldiers of Lewis and Harris to allow for the extra travel needed to come and visit their families, so they could spend the same amount of time with their families as their lowland compatriots. When the ILS sank in 1919, the committee worked with Stornoway Town Council to raise money and provide relief to the bereaved families. In 1913, there was a kind of a change in government, local government organisation. The parish councils who dealt with poor law were swept away, as was the district committee, and it all became part of the district council, which existed through till 1975. And so they took on all of those roles previously been held by those other authorities. One of the other nice collections we have, which have never really been used, is the valuation rolls for the area. We've got these from 1899 through till 1973, and they really list, they're a taxation record essentially, to know how much to tax people. So every rateable house in the district is listed in here. So this is you see part of Lurbos here with the croft numbers, who the proprietor is. All through the book it's all Duncan Matheson as the landowner, who the tenant is and the occupier. 99 times out of 100 for Lochs, the tenant is the same person as the occupier. There are some exceptions where maybe somebody has died and the tenant is the heirs, but the occupier is somebody who's been sublet to. But these, on the mainland, they're usually used for house history, to find out when a house was built, to see when land was apportioned, to see when factories were put up, etc. Up here, I think you probably know better than this record what the history of your individual crofts are, but they are a nice way in and another way of seeing the world. School records are always popular, and probably are one of the most popular things that we have. So the Education Scotland Act of 1872 introduced compulsory education for the first time for everybody in Scotland. Prior to 1872, education was really undertaken at a parish level, and there was a parish school down in Lemmerway and one over in Carloway, but as far as I was aware, there wasn't one here. You had a free church school, but not a parish school. And there were a proliferation over the 200 years before that of various charity schools coming up. So things like the Scottish Society for the Proliferation of Christian Knowledge, Gaelic School Society, and the Ladies' Schools. The Tasglan's records really start from 1872 with the start of the Education Act. And we have a full set of school board minutes from 1873 for the Lochs area all the way through to the Modern Day Education Committee of the Caller, and it's a continuous line that's unbroken. It's probably one of our best collections of records, certainly better than some of the minutes that we've got. As well as that, with the library, we look after the logbooks for many of the schools in the area and the admission registers where they exist. So in 1873, when the school boards were established, there were parish schools in Lemmerway and the free church schools in Lurbost and Carloway. The Carloway and Lemmerway schools were transferred to the board, but the Lurbost Free Church decided to discontinue their school but retain the congregational building, the building for congregational use. And this is the 1899 map, so it's 15 years after the establishment of the schools, and you can see the Free Church down here, and you can probably just see school down here. So either it's still being referred to as the schoolhouse, you'll probably know better than me, it could be the Sunday school building, or it could be a hangover from a previous edition of the map, and they've just kept it. If anybody wants to tell me later on, you probably have a better idea than I do. So because they weren't handing over the Lurbost school, a new one was built, and its location is described as Astable near the old gate on the road at Lurbost, and the school was to cover the area of Lurbost, Crossbost, Reynish, Grimshader and Cruggery. However, when they actually did an audit of the school-aged children in the area at the time, it was pretty obvious that Lurbost wasn't going to accommodate the numbers we required. So they decided to put another school in at Reynish, and Grimshader came on a few years later. And when Grimshader opened, the first entry in the logbook says only 2 children turned up on the first day of the school there because the parents refused to send them until a new road was built. They all turned up the following week, so the whipper-in must have been out and had to go at them. But, you know, that was the numbers at the time. It's scary to see how it's changed. Another school was planned at Achmore to also cover the Loch Anvenich, which was technically in the Uig parish area. So due to its location, it was decided that the school would be jointly managed and funded by both the Lochs and Uig school boards. Although from 1875 it had its own school board, though it usually met in Soval Lodge or Knockyandu rather than in Achmore itself. So presumably the board members didn't like travelling. I don't know. That school opened in 1877, and pasted into the minute book is the advert for the teacher that they were looking for at the time. Looking for a female teacher, presumably because they're cheaper to employ than a male teacher. But they wanted a certified female teacher. That meant that they would attract a greater government grant. The government grant was split usually 50% to the teacher to supplement their own income and 50% to the school board to provide books, etc. So the more qualified you could get, the better it was. But obviously, you know, they were watching the pennies.
Does it tell you who got the job?
It will do in the school minute in the minute book. So you can go through this and find pretty much every single teacher that ever worked in there, and you can pair that up with the logbooks as well.
So it would be a one-teacher school for...
That would have been a one-teacher school, and even some of the other schools were probably only one teachers, even though they had 70 kids in them.
We were there too.
Okay, so the board minutes are predominantly deal with the locations where the schools are going to be, the appointment of teachers, discipline, matters to do with the curriculum, the government grants, and the annual inspections from HMSI. The minutes note in 1892 that grants were made available for the teaching of Gaelic in the schools, which hadn't been included in the syllabus until that point. And obviously, many of you will know the history of Gaelic far better than I do. It was actively discouraged, and the syllabuses were very English biased, to the point that actually probably to the detriment of the children. But the board immediately, on this kind of notification, informed all teachers to introduce reading by standards 4 and upwards of the Gaelic scriptures with translations into English twice a week during the time set aside for religious instruction, and to suggest that in cases where the head teacher is not a Gaelic speaker, that reading on these days should be supervised by a native pupil teacher or a monitor. It is expected that the teachers will supply at their own cost the Gaelic scriptures required. Some things don't change. The logbooks themselves, many of you I'm sure will be familiar with, and I've tried to bring up a logbook for each school, which is out there for you to look at afterwards, for where we have them to survive. And together with the school minute books, you can really start to get a good picture of what's going on. So we have logbooks for Achmore, Fidegary and Grimshader. The other schools in the area don't appear to have survived. School closures are always a dangerous time for these things to disappear. Head teachers walk off with them. They turn up in families, or occasionally they turn up in second-hand bookstores and find their way back. We keep our eyes open. Teachers are supposed to record in the logbooks the introductions of new books, courses of instructions, the visits of managers and inspectors, and any affect attendance to the school, such as weather. And various teachers did this to different levels of diligence. So sometimes you get screeds, other times you'll get 4 years worth of same as last week, same as last week, same as last week, because the teacher couldn't be bothered. So I've taken some of things that I kind of liked and found attractive. So Grimshader in November 1906, attendance only fair, children being kept away as potato lifting in progress, one or two children sick with cold. To this be a thanking day, a few boys were left in the afternoon. So you start to see the effect of the agricultural year and the crofting year affecting attendance at schools, much to the annoyance of some teachers in various districts who got quite ferocious in their logbooks about it, but probably didn't actually mind all that much. They kept the logbook for the inspectors to show them they were trying to be diligent teachers. It wasn't really kept as a historical record. That's almost an accident. March in 1913. Attendance not so good this week. Weather being stormy. As this is Communion Week, Thursday was given as a holiday. So the effect of the church year, but also the weather. And when we talk to young children and try and get them to think about what it must have been like to be a pupil there, coming to school barefoot, having to walk 4 miles, not having mum drive you, they start to their eyes start to light up a little bit. And they realise they've got it quite good. One more. Attendance not so good. 3 scholars kept from school this week with scarlet fever. And obviously, we've got examples around the islands of schools being shut for 3 months at a time because there's been an outbreak of influenza. And deaths recorded of children passing away from what is now obviously something that's really simply dealt with. All seniors are making good progress with their work. The juniors are not so well up on their work, as teacher finds it impossible to pay them the attention they need on account of having so many classes. The school is kept clean and tidy. So you can see, it probably wasn't just, they were pretty stretched. Moving on to Fiddigery. Received 1 ton and 16 cubic weight of coal today. Headmaster gave a few exercises of new physical education to advanced division and senior classes today in the schoolrooms, as the playground is a mess with mud, which is just has an advantage, 20 kids in a room this size kind of doing whatever. But 2 weeks later, headmaster unfit to walk to school today, sprained his right foot while teaching. So maybe the class didn't work out that well. That made me chuckle when I saw it, and it's nice to see something almost comic in these records. He does go on to complain that the playground is still muddy and the exercise classes are being done in different rooms around the schools. Moving on, we can't not talk about the Eilean and talk about records of the island. So in the aftermath of the disaster, the Lewis District Committee and the Stornoway Town Council met within days to set up the fund. And we have all of the minutes and the financial records relating to that. But what's probably the most poignant is the actual individual applications that were made by the families of the bereaved. And again, these are still covered by data protection and won't, in theory, be public until 2020, 100 years after the disaster, and even then it might be a bit longer. A simple application form was completed for each case, and quite often that was done by a relative or a friend, or even the local minister. In many cases, letters requesting assistance accompany the application, and these can be really moving and tragic. As I mentioned, they're closed for 100 years, but I took one anonymised extract from the Lochs area. I respectfully beg and apply to your committee for some help owing to my present circumstances. I lost my whole support in the death of my son in the Eilean disaster, and a month ago I lost my daughter. I receive over 7 shillings a week pension. The funeral expenses of my daughter have left me penniless. And this is where you get people crying on archives. Often it's when things go wrong or there's need of major administration that records become voluminous, and that's where we get large collections. And I think it says something about us as a society that it's the power of records like that we fiercely guard, protect with legislation, because when they relate to tragedy and hardship. And it's not just for the reasons of privacy that we kind of protect them and don't necessarily want people looking at them, but because they document something about our own communities. It's interesting, we don't have lots of records of happy smiling people walking around Stornoway because you didn't need to document that. They might not have been happy and smiling, but you know, it's just the nature of record keeping is quite often it more focused on the negative than the positive. So moving on to something a little bit lighter. This is a letter that we took in relatively recently from to Lady Matheson in August 1962 from Mr. Hutchison, who at that time was the proprietor, was the tenant at Soval Lodge, running it as a hunting estate, concerning arrangements for a visiting fishing party. In the letter, he suggests options for entertaining the party, mainly coming from the from England and mainland Scotland, and points out issues relating to midges and whether the weather is suitable for bathing in the water. He also discusses the menu for an evening meal that they're going to have, in which he lists, because it's always better if you put things in French apparently, mutton top and bottom, salmon to quarters, entrees of 2 frites, venison steaks, assuming that they're able to catch a stag, and sauté à la bubble de squeak, or squeak de bubble, sorry. It's just like that. He then goes on in the second half of that letter to talk about how he'd seen her at a function at the Lewes Castle a week before, and he gets really drippy and quite a bit sleazy, actually, to be honest, about how beautiful she was and how he couldn't come and talk to her because other people were around her, and it was just all a bit. Yes. It makes for interesting times. A couple of other items and collections we have, which aren't really related to North Lochs, but are all things that you'll probably remember, is a collection related to D.D. Morrison's electrical retailer. It was established on Cromwell Street in town in the 1920s. I'm sure probably many of you bought radios and appliances from there over the time. It's a very small collection of business records, purchase ledgers, account books, photographs, and stationery like what you can see here. But however, it's a part of the island's kind of commercial heritage that was worth preserving, and it's coming to us. And we are always on the lookout for kind of records like that, which have a kind of an island-wide significance. These weren't just Stornoway shops, people were coming from all over the islands to them. This is one of my favourite photographs in the whole collection. And this is actually not for the fish, but for the Lewes Coffee House Company, which you can see in the background on the left-hand side, which is where the Star Inn is, and you've got Anderson MacArthur's next to it, which at that point was the bank. So this is a much earlier business collection. The business was established for the coffee house in 1878 as a temperance alternative to the kind of the licensed premises in Stornoway. Members could drink coffee and other beverages, enjoy cakes and snacks, and for a small fee could access the reading room where the latest newspapers and periodicals could be read. This is the day of a fish market or a fish sale happening on the pier, and so it just happens by accident they've caught the town. The company itself was wound up in 1911, ironically only a couple of years before Stornoway went dry. People had just stopped using it. One of the other collections we took in last year was the main archive of the Harris Tweed Authority, because if anyone should have it, it should be in the islands. Inverness sat on a little bit of stuff, which is due to come back to us if Lewes Castle when Lewes Castle comes together. That collection is predominantly a 20th century collection of minutes and financial papers and buckets and buckets and buckets of legal case claims for people passing off Harris Tweed when it's not. You can't look at trademark history in the UK and not look at Harris Tweed, I don't think, and therefore it's a really, really internationally important collection. It has not yet been catalogued. It has been kind of box listed at a very broad level, which Donna and Katie Ann, who used to work on the project with me, spent a week in the attics in Garden Road surrounded by dead wasps listing this stuff. It's not glamorous being an archivist all the time. You do find yourself underneath tables in dirty corners trying to find things. But that's a very rather a wonderful collection. Another collection that was surveyed recently was Macrae's Undertakers. As the only undertakers on the island, it's sadly one of those places we're all going to have a relationship with someday. They have great day books. They're kind of diaries of who their clients were on that day. I can never find the right words for these kind of things. But because it was a personal family company, they're not just kind of saying such and such a person was buried on this day. You get little asides, maybe how they died or information like that. And the company was obviously very had war contracts for repatriating the dead. And I don't know if you have any more, not mortcloth societies or funeral societies in this area, which were involved with maybe bringing people who die in Inverness back. I know some of the other common equerries have got those kind of collections. You come across McRae's paperheads all the time. It's just unfortunate that they're one of those kind of people that you can't avoid. But a wonderful company with a wonderful history. Donna spent a lot of time going around the landed estates as well, rummaging around in their cupboards to find out what they had up and down the islands. Obviously, since 1925, when Lewis was broken up into all the separate estates, records have gone missing for some of the smaller estates. But she's been into Soval, Moorsgale, various other places, rummaging through their cupboards. The kind of records they have are not really to do with rents and things like that, which were kind of dealt with out of Stornoway. But it's more to do with the hunting, fishing, shooting, log books that you kind of find, the kind of thing that David Jones is very interested in and publishes widely on. The last slide I have for you is an image of Achmore, and you can see the roads. This is actually an estate map that we were given recently. And when you look at the fuller map, it's the whole of North Harris and Lewis. And it's coloured in the fishing rights for the Gower and Hine estates, probably from the early 20th century. But in typical kind of like, we'll reuse a document way that happens in archives, it was then reused. And you might be able to see a line coming down here, Achmore with a couple of flags around it, and then it carries on down. And this is actually a Leverhulme period proposed train line for the islands. He actually had a line going all the way around, starting off in Stornoway, going up through Laxdale, going round to Gress, where there was a station, up to Tolster, across the moor to Adderbroch, round down to Barvas, back across the moor to Laxdale and into town. There was another branch line that's on this map going from Barvas down to Dalmore and Dalbeg. It gets a bit unclear as to where it went beyond there. And there was this other branch line coming up through Laxdale, coming round the back of New Valley, and then down through to Achmore, down the back of Ballan, all the way down to Loch Allen. I've brought this map with me and I'm happy to get it out, but it'll probably have to go on the floor in here or something because it's a really large map. But it's fascinating to look at because it's a properly surveyed map. It's not somebody on the back of an envelope doing it. It's been properly surveyed, mileage points, and they followed the terrain. It's not just kind of, we can do that, and that. I love the idea of there being a full train service in the islands because it would have been a beautiful way to get around. But obviously it never came to fruition. But it's just one of those serendipitous things that turn up occasionally in archive collections. I just wanted to highlight a couple of other bits and pieces of work that the Tasglann project's been doing, because it's not just all about going out and looking at archives, it's about disseminating information. We haven't launched our website yet, though it is live, and it's available in both Gaelic and English. And up here we put the products of everything that we do. So I took this screenshot last night, and on it, so the fact that I was doing a talk down here goes in, and the slides and the text from this talk I'll put up on here as well, so everyone can get access to it, and I'm happy to send a copy to you if you want it for your own records here. Each community and heritage group around the islands has a page on here where we give some details of the contacts. The Tasglann as a brand, if you want to call it something, I suppose, it's not about the records that the council holds. And us as an archive service, we've always meant this website to be about finding the raw materials wherever in the island they are, not just with us. So the historical societies play a major part in this, obviously. We've got various image galleries which we're slowly building up. So the Sinking of the SS Norge, there was a programme about that last year. And so we've done the research, we've got lots of images. So we thought, well, we've got them, we'll put them in an image gallery online. I gave a talk up in Ness, so those have gone up. And we're slowly building up the image galleries and putting more on. So this is where I'll put the images that I've included for today, just to give people a flavour of what's available. One of the core aspects of the site is a collections database. which all these archives that are held in private hands, held by businesses, public authorities, we put the catalogues online. So people will be able to come and search. They can search for Lochs and they can find records all over the place. So I just did a quick search for Lochs here and came up with 30 returns. There's about 250 collections in there at the moment, and it's building all the time. And they're all indexed. I'm sure there's more, but that's not only, you can see Loch Parochial Board is the first hit that came back, but there's records in Edinburgh, Glasgow, Skye, Inverness that are also captured in here. So people can try and see the fact that it's a distributed heritage all over the place. You don't just come to one place to study these things. That's part of the beauty of research, is that you have to go out and find these things. There's also numerous pages on here of links to other organisations where you can find information. Highland Archives, National Records of Scotland, National Library, Skye, and various private places. 2 final slides, very quick. I just wanted to say something about what's going on at Lewes Castle, because it's one of those questions that always comes up, especially because people saw what was going on and all of a sudden it halted when Pattons went under, which I think caused a few people in the council to lose their hair. The work has now restarted again. The contract was re-awarded after Pattons to get the building works on the main building sorted out, the roof finished, and the main place went watertight. And I think it's out to tender at the moment to do the new build museum and archive that's going out the back on the footprint of what used to be the glass houses during the Matheson period. What the archive and castle is doing, the Tasglann project itself finishes in November this year when our funding runs out, and we're morphing into being part of the heritage service of the council. But much of what we've done, we will continue to do. We're not going to be desk-based people in Stornoway sat there, saying, come to us. It's still going to be very much out and about. And I know this is the first time you've seen me in the flesh, but believe me, I've been up and down this island more times than I care to remember. But it means that there will be, for the first time, a permanent archive service in the islands, professionally staffed, based up there. We're getting, obviously, lovely new storage, which means that the council's own collections can start to grow. That's the council's official archive, not taking in records from other areas that would normally go to a common estuary. We're not looking to step on anyone's toes in that way. We're really looking at those kind of like pan-island bodies, like the NHS, etc., that that can be collected, as well as the caller's own historical records. And obviously there'll be a dedicated research room with that, but the emphasis will be on outreach and continuing to work in partnership with people up and down the islands. Because we will have a brand spanking new storage area, it means that many records that are not currently held on the island will come back to the islands. So things like the records relating to the churches, which I mentioned, but also lots of records that are currently held in the National Archives in Edinburgh to do with customs and excise, which date back to, I think, into the early 1700s. The fisheries, from the agriculture and fisheries series held there. And there's various small business collections that found their way to the National Archives in Edinburgh because there was really not anywhere else for them to go. And they're very keen, as long as there is something as good as what is in Edinburgh, if not better, and we will actually have better storage than Edinburgh, then they can come back. We won't get the Seaforth papers, unfortunately, which would be the jewel in the crown for Lewis, because it covers many estates, not just here. They had estates in other parts of the country, like Dumfries and Galloway, and so therefore they can't give us one bit and maybe give Dumfries and Galloway another bit. They don't start splitting up collections. It's not the done thing in the archive world. But we'll also see some records coming back from Inverness, from Highland Archives, having been part of Ross and Cromarty. They took a few bits and pieces which really should come back here eventually. But it's also a chance to start looking at new collections, so really starting to look at the emergency services, so the records relating to the police, relating to the islands, and the fire brigade. I am reliably informed that the fire service have lots of building plans for building up and down the islands, which we don't have on the island anymore, because they needed them for if they were called out to know what the building layout was to go and do whatever rescue work it was they were up to. The NHS's records will hopefully come in, and as I mentioned, kind of the wider pan-island bodies, not looking to step on anyone's toes, as I say. that's my contact details, so you can get us on there. I'm happy to answer any inquiries that come our way. No inquiry is too stupid or too small or too trivial. We have all sorts of interesting, exciting things come through, from kind of like deep, dark academic research through to people wanting to know what the word for a town square was in Gaelic. Was one that came through recently because there was somewhere in Canada had taken what they thought was a Gaelic name. Is it cross? No. I can't. What do you call the crosses on a kind of like dancing socks? Have they got a name? The checks? No, diamonds. No, they said, is diamond a Gaelic word for a town square? This is a Canadian coming at us. And it's just like, no. Many places wouldn't have had a town square because they weren't big enough. They might have had a meeting place. The logical thing is, if it's a square, and an American baseball is called a diamond, I'm assuming that's where it came from. It's certainly not a Gaelic word anyway, but that's the kind of crazy stuff we get. So please do feel to get in touch. You also, if any of these records have whetted your appetite and it's something you want to come and look at, contact me. You can come and sit in our office and look at records. We're more than happy to let you to do that. And if somebody's feeling really eager and would like to come and index the poor law applications up until 1912, you would be more than welcome to do so, because they are a mine of information, and at the moment we just have to take a pot luck that somebody might be in there. But you'll be more than welcome to do that. Thank you for listening. If anyone's got any questions, I'm happy to take them. If not, I think it's time for a cup of tea.